For over half a century, Sweden was held up as proof that social democracy could work. It built a society that seemed to have solved capitalism's contradictions. Free healthcare, free education, generous pensions, year-long parental leave, and still one of the world's most prosperous economies. Stockholm's clean streets and elegant design became symbols of what enlightened governance could achieve. The Swedish model, they called it, a middle path between American capitalism and Soviet communism. Economists studied it, politicians envied it, citizens of other nations wondered why their own countries could not be more like Sweden. But today, that model is collapsing. Gang violence has turned Swedish cities into conflict zones with grenade attacks and shootings that would shock even American cities. The welfare state, once the crown jewel of Nordic success, is buckling under costs it can never sustain. The industrial giants that funded Sweden's generosity, Volvo, Saab, and Ericsson, are shadows of their former selves, sold off to foreign owners or struggling to compete. And perhaps most telling, Swedes themselves are leaving. The country that once attracted the world's talent is now watching its own best and brightest flee to nations with lower taxes and higher opportunity. So what happened? How did the country that seemed to have perfected the art of prosperity become a cautionary tale of good intentions? Gone wrong. Today, we are exploring why Sweden's wealth is gone forever and what happens when a society discovers that generosity without growth is just a slower path to bankruptcy. Sweden's golden age began in the aftermath of World War II. Though unlike most of Europe, Sweden emerged from the war untouched. Neutral throughout the conflict, its factories were intact, its cities unscathed, and its workforce ready to build. While Germany, France, and Britain dug out from rubble, Sweden was already producing. That head start mattered enormously in the decades that followed. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Sweden built what many considered the world's most successful economy. It was not just about growth, though there was plenty of that. Sweden's gross domestic product per capita rose from roughly $8,000 in 1950 to over $45,000 by 1990 in today's dollars. But what made Sweden special was how that wealth was distributed. The Social Democrats, who governed for most of this period, created a comprehensive welfare state funded by high, but seemingly sustainable, taxes. Everyone had access to excellent healthcare. University education was free, childcare was subsidized, pensions were generous, and yet the economy thrived. How did they pull it off? The foundation was a cluster of world-class companies that dominated global markets. Volvo and Saab produced cars renowned for safety and quality. Ericsson became a telecommunications giant, producing the equipment that powered mobile networks worldwide. IKEA revolutionized furniture retail with flat-pack design and democratic pricing. SKF dominated ball bearings. Electrolux led in appliances. Atlas Copco led in industrial tools. These were not just successful companies. They were global champions that generated enormous tax revenue and employed hundreds of thousands of highly paid workers. In 1990, Swedish multinationals accounted for over 40% of the country's total employment. That is an extraordinary concentration of economic power and wealth generation. But Swedish success was not built on exploitation or natural resources. It was built on innovation, engineering excellence, and a culture of collaboration between labor unions, corporations, and government. The Wren-Meidner model, as economists called it, created coordinated wage bargaining that kept labor costs competitive while maintaining high living standards. Companies invested heavily in research and development, spending over 3.5% of GDP, among the highest rates in the world. Universities produced world-class engineers and scientists. The Nobel Prize, awarded in Stockholm, reinforced the country's image as a center of intellectual achievement. By 1990, Sweden ranked as the fourth wealthiest country per capita globally. Life expectancy was among the highest on earth. Crime was negligible. Social trust was off the charts. Cities were clean, efficient, and beautiful. The Swedish model seemed to have achieved the impossible, generous social programs combined with dynamic economic growth. Visitors returned home asking, "Why can't we be more like Sweden?" But that success rested on conditions that were already beginning to erode. The companies that funded Sweden's generosity were globalizing, moving production to lower-cost countries. The demographics that made the welfare state affordable, a large working population supporting relatively few retirees, were shifting toward an older, more dependent society, and political decisions made in the name of humanitarian values would soon collide with economic reality in ways that no one anticipated. The wealth that seemed permanent was about to vanish. The turning point for modern Sweden can be traced to a series of decisions in the 1990s and 2000s that fundamentally altered the nation's trajectory. The first major shock came from economic crisis. From 1990 to 1991, Sweden experienced its worst recession since the 1930s. A property bubble burst. Banks failed. Unemployment soared from 2% to over 8% in just 2 years. The government was forced to devalue the currency and abandon the fixed exchange rate to the European currency unit. For a country that had gone decades without serious economic turbulence, it was a wake-up call. The response was predictable, but ultimately damaging. Rather than using the crisis to restructure the welfare state or reduce costs, Sweden chose to maintain benefits while cutting corporate taxes to attract investment. The top corporate tax rate fell from 52% in 1990 to just 22% by 2013, one of the lowest in Europe. The idea was that lower taxes would encourage companies to keep operations in Sweden and create jobs. But here is what actually happened. Companies pocketed the savings and continued offshoring production. Swedish multinationals increasingly became Swedish in name only, with headquarters in Stockholm, but factories, research centers, and workforces scattered globally. Then came the decision that would change Sweden forever. In 2015, at the height of Europe's refugee crisis, Sweden opened its doors wider than any other European nation relative to its population. That year alone, Sweden received 163,000 asylum applications, the highest per capita in Europe. For a country of just 10 million people, that is the equivalent of the United States accepting 5 million refugees in a single year. The decision was driven by humanitarian principles, a reflection of Sweden's self-image as a moral leader. But the economic and social consequences were not adequately considered. Integration costs were astronomical from the start. Each refugee required housing, language training, education, healthcare, and social services. The government estimated the annual cost at 50 billion kroner, roughly $6 billion. But the real cost proved far higher when accounting for education, welfare support, and infrastructure strain. More critically, labor market integration failed spectacularly. After 5 years in Sweden, only 50% of refugees from Middle Eastern and African countries had found employment, and most of those jobs were low-wage positions requiring government subsidies to employers. The welfare state math began to break down. Sweden's generous system was designed for a society where nearly everyone worked and contributed taxes throughout their adult lives. It was never designed to support large populations with permanently low employment rates. When the working age employment rate drops from 82% to 78%, as it did from 2006 to 2016, the entire fiscal foundation shifts. Fewer tax contributors supporting more benefit recipients means only two options: cut benefits or raise taxes. Sweden tried raising taxes, but there is a limit to how much you can extract before people and capital flee. At the same time, Swedish industrial champions were stumbling. In 2010, Volvo Cars, the iconic Swedish automaker, was sold to China's Geely. Saab went bankrupt in 2011 and ceased production. Ericsson, once employing over 100,000 people globally, shrank to barely 60,000 as it lost market share to Huawei, Samsung, and Nokia. These were not just corporate failures, they were the collapse of the tax base that had funded Sweden's model for generations. When Volvo was Swedish-owned, its profits were taxed in Sweden and its executives paid Swedish income taxes. Under Chinese ownership, that revenue stream shifted overseas. Sweden kept some jobs but lost the wealth generation. The combination proved toxic. Rising welfare costs met declining industrial tax revenues just as demographic pressures intensified. The government's response, trying to maintain the old model through ever higher taxes on remaining workers and businesses, only accelerated the exodus of the very people and companies Sweden needed most. To maintain its humanitarian principles, Sweden mortgaged its economic future. The bill is now coming due, and it is far larger than anyone predicted. The Swedish welfare state, once considered the gold standard of social democracy, is now consuming itself. The math is brutal and getting worse every year. In 2023, total public spending reached 51% of GDP, meaning the government spends more than half of everything the country produces. To put that in perspective, the United States spends about 38% of GDP on government. Even France, famous for its extensive social programs, spends around 58%, but with a much larger and more diverse economy to support it. Sweden's welfare system costs break down like this. Healthcare consumes roughly 11% of GDP, among the highest in Europe. Pensions and elderly care account for another 14%. Education takes 7%. Unemployment and social assistance absorb 6%. And here is the killer. Housing support and migration-related costs now exceed 3% of GDP, triple what they were in 2010. When you add up all the commitments, Sweden has locked itself into spending obligations that exceed what the tax base can sustainably support. The demographic mathematics make this unsustainable. In 1990, Sweden had 4.2 working-age adults for every person over 65. By 2025, that ratio has fallen to just 3.1. By 2040, it is projected to drop below 2.5. That means every retiree will be supported by just 2.5 workers instead of 4. Sweden's pension system, like most welfare states, operates on a pay-as-you-go basis. Current workers pay for current retirees. When the ratio collapses, either benefits must be cut dramatically or taxes on workers must rise to crushing levels. Sweden is discovering there is a limit to both. Here is where it gets truly dangerous. Sweden has tried to square this circle through immigration, bringing in working-age people to rebuild the tax base, but the employment rates among immigrant populations remain stubbornly low. Among refugees and family reunion immigrants, the employment rate after 10 years in Sweden is just 60%, compared to 85% for native Swedes. Even worse, those who do find work are disproportionately in low-wage sectors or subsidized employment, meaning they contribute far less in taxes than native workers while consuming similar welfare benefits. An analysis by economist Tino Sanandaji calculated that the net fiscal cost of immigration to Sweden between 2000 and 2015 exceeded 1% of GDP annually, roughly 50 billion kroner per year. That's not a one-time cost. It's a permanent drain that compounds as family reunification brings more dependence. When you are adding population but not adding net taxpayers, you are not solving the welfare state crisis, you are accelerating it. Meanwhile, the welfare state's generosity is being gamed in ways that make the problem worse. Sweden's sick leave system, once a source of pride, has become unsustainable. In 2023, 11% of working-age Swedes were on long-term sick leave, collecting 80% of their salary without working. That is double the rate from 2010. Some of this reflects genuine health issues, particularly rising mental health problems, but studies show widespread abuse, with many using the system as de facto early retirement or supplemental income. And then there is the corruption of the system itself. Sweden's attempt to maintain Scandinavian generosity while dealing with populations unfamiliar with high-trust social norms has led to epidemic welfare, fraud, fraudulent disability claims, fake businesses collecting subsidies, benefit tourism, where people move to Sweden specifically for generous welfare payments. An investigation found that fraud related to child allowances, housing benefits, and sickness benefits cost the state over 10 billion kroner annually. And that is just the detected fraud. But here is what makes this welfare trap truly inescapable. Every attempt to reform it faces impossible political obstacles. Retirees who vote in huge numbers will never accept pension cuts. Public sector unions, representing over 40% of the workforce, block any efficiency measures. And any party that proposes serious reform is immediately branded as cruel, heartless, or un-Swedish. So the system continues, consuming more resources every year while producing less value. Sweden is not just running out of money, it is running out of workers, taxpayers, and time. The welfare state that once symbolized Swedish success has become a parasite draining the host economy. And there is no political will to stop it before it is too late. Sweden's industrial decline is the silent catastrophe behind its economic crisis. The companies that once made Sweden wealthy are now gone, sold, or shadows of their former selves. And unlike the welfare state's slow-motion collapse, this wealth destruction happened in just 2 decades, fast enough to notice but too slow to spark political action. Start with the automotive industry. In 1990, Volvo and Saab employed over 80,000 people in Sweden. Engineers, designers, factory workers, all earning high wages and paying high taxes. Volvo was not just a car company. It was a technology incubator that pioneered safety systems like 3-point seatbelts and crumple zones that became industry standards. Its profits funded Swedish research institutions and flowed through the economy in multiplier effects. When Volvo's passenger car division was sold to Ford in 1999 and then to China's Geely in 2010, Sweden lost more than a company. It lost an entire industrial ecosystem. Saab's death was even more symbolic. Founded in 1945 to build aircraft, Saab became synonymous with Swedish engineering. But chronic underinvestment, failed ownership changes, and inability to compete globally led to bankruptcy in 2011. The brand that once represented Swedish innovation now sits dormant, owned by a struggling Chinese electric vehicle company that has produced exactly 0 cars. The factory in Trollhättan, once employing 3,400 workers, sits largely empty, the skilled workers scattered to other industries or other countries. That knowledge, accumulated over 60 years, is simply gone. Ericsson's decline followed a different but equally damaging path. In 2000, Ericsson was the world's 3rd largest mobile phone manufacturer and the dominant telecommunications equipment supplier. It employed over 100,000 people and was the crown jewel of Swedish technology. But it missed the smartphone revolution entirely, losing out to Nokia, Apple, and Samsung. By 2012, it had exited the handset business completely. Its telecom equipment business survived, but as a much diminished player, constantly cutting costs to compete with Chinese rivals like Huawei that operate with government subsidies and access to closed markets. Today, Ericsson employs around 60,000 globally, but only about 15,000 in Sweden, down from over 30,000 in 2000. Its R&D spending has shifted to lower-cost countries. The high-margin, intellectual property development that once happened in Stockholm now occurs in India, China, and Eastern Europe. Sweden keeps the headquarters and some legacy research, but the wealth generation has moved elsewhere. The pattern repeats across Swedish industry. IKEA, still privately held by the Kamprad family, has gradually shifted production almost entirely outside Sweden. Of the 2,000 plus products in a typical IKEA store, fewer than 50 are still made in Sweden. The company employs just 20,000 people in Sweden out of 240,000 globally. And through aggressive tax planning, much of IKEA's profit never sees Swedish tax jurisdiction at all, flowing through Dutch and Luxembourg holding companies. But here's what makes this industrial collapse so devastating. Sweden hasn't replaced these industries with new ones. There's no Swedish Google, no Swedish Tesla, no Swedish breakthrough companies creating the next generation of wealth. Swedish startups, when they do succeed, are almost immediately sold to foreign buyers. Skype was founded in Sweden but sold to eBay, then Microsoft. Spotify remains Swedish but is publicly traded, with most shares held by American investors, and its tax optimization means limited Swedish revenue. King Digital, maker of Candy Crush, was Swedish but sold to Activision Blizzard. Why can't Sweden create and keep world-class companies anymore? The tax burden is crushing for high earners and entrepreneurs. If you build a successful company in Sweden, you will pay 20% corporate tax, then 30% capital gains tax when you sell, then up to 52% income tax on dividends. By the time you actually access the wealth you created, 70% has been taxed away. Compare that to Singapore, where capital gains are untaxed, or the UAE, where there is no income tax at all. Talented entrepreneurs do the math and leave before building anything. Venture capital flows reflect this. Sweden's total venture capital investment in 2023 was around $2 billion. Silicon Valley alone attracted over $150 billion. Even adjusting for population, Sweden is punching far below its weight. Much of Swedish venture capital money goes to foreign startups or quickly exits to international markets because the domestic market is too small and too expensive. The human capital drain compounds the problem. Sweden's best engineering graduates increasingly look abroad immediately after university. A computer science graduate from KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, can earn $80,000 starting in Stockholm, but $150,000 or more in San Francisco, London, or Dubai. After taxes, the gap is even wider. Why stay in a country where 52% of your income disappears when you can keep 70% or 80% elsewhere? What is left in Sweden is a service economy, government employment, and low-margin industries. Stockholm still has a financial sector, but it's tiny compared to London or Frankfurt. The country has tourism, but that is low-wage and seasonal. It has timber and mining, but those industries are capital-intensive with few employees. The high-wage, high-value industries that funded Sweden's golden age are simply gone, and with them went the tax revenue that made the welfare state possible. Sweden is trying to maintain 1980s social programs with a 2025 industrial base that is a fraction of what it once was. The numbers don't work. They never will again. Perhaps nothing symbolizes Sweden's transformation more starkly than the explosion of gang violence that has turned one of the world's safest countries into one of Europe's most dangerous. In 2012, Sweden recorded 68 shooting incidents. In 2022, there were over 390. That's a 470% increase in just a decade. Bombings, once virtually unknown, now occur with horrifying regularity. In 2023 alone, Sweden experienced over 90 bomb attacks, mostly grenade attacks targeting apartment buildings, restaurants, and businesses in suburbs with large immigrant populations. Let that sink in. Grenade attacks in Sweden. A country that had not experienced war on its territory since 1814 now deals with military ordnance being used in criminal gang conflicts. Police report that Sweden has the highest per capita gun death rate in Europe, surpassing even Italy with its mafia. Cities like Malmö, Gothenburg, and Stockholm have neighborhoods where emergency services refuse to enter without police escort. Ambulances and fire trucks have been targeted by stone-throwing gangs. Postal workers are refusing to deliver in certain areas. These are not scenes from a failing state. This is Sweden in 2025. How did this happen? The root cause is failed integration of immigrant populations, particularly refugees and family reunion migrants from the Middle East, North Africa, and Somalia. When Sweden accepted massive numbers of asylum seekers without adequate plans for integration, employment, or cultural assimilation, it created parallel societies. In suburbs like Rinkeby, Husby, Rosengård, and Tensta, over 80% of residents are foreign-born or have foreign-born parents. Unemployment among young men often exceeds 50%. Swedish language skills are limited. Connection to mainstream Swedish society is minimal. In this vacuum, organized crime flourished. Criminal networks, many with roots in Middle Eastern and Balkan criminal organizations, recruit young men who see no path to legitimate success. The Swedish welfare system, generous as it is, provides survival but not purpose or dignity. Selling drugs or working as muscle for criminal syndicates offers both money and belonging. And Swedish criminal penalties, designed for a high-trust society where shame and social pressure once deterred crime, are laughably weak by international standards. A convicted murderer in Sweden serves on average 12 to 14 years. Gang members caught with illegal weapons often receive suspended sentences or minimal jail time. The criminal justice system, built on rehabilitation rather than punishment, assumes criminals want to reform. But when you are dealing with organized criminal networks that view prison as a temporary inconvenience and view Swedish courts as weak, the system fails completely. Criminals calculate the odds and decide crime pays. The economic costs are staggering. Policing costs in high crime areas have tripled. Property values in affected neighborhoods have collapsed, destroying household wealth for those who cannot afford to move. Business investment avoids these areas entirely. An analysis estimated that crime costs Sweden 150 billion kroner annually, about 3% of GDP in direct costs, lost productivity, and reduced investment. That is equivalent to the entire defense budget. But the human cost cut deeper. Native Swedes are fleeing immigrant-heavy areas en masse, a phenomenon often called white flight, but too politically sensitive to acknowledge officially. Schools in these areas struggle with violence, truancy, and students who do not speak Swedish at home. Teachers report being threatened, assaulted, and unable to maintain classroom order. Many schools in immigrant suburbs now require security guards, metal detectors, and police presence, something unthinkable in Sweden 2 decades ago. And here is what makes this crisis so intractable. Swedish political culture, rooted in consensus and tolerance, refuses to acknowledge the problem honestly. For years, politicians insisted that gang violence had nothing to do with immigration or integration failure. To suggest otherwise was to be branded racist or xenophobic. Major media outlets suppressed information about perpetrators' backgrounds. Police were discouraged from collecting ethnicity data. The result was policy paralysis. By the time political consensus shifted and leaders acknowledged the crisis, criminal networks were deeply entrenched. Recent governments have tried to respond with increased police funding, tougher sentencing, and deportation of criminal foreign nationals. But these are band-aids on a bullet wound. The parallel societies already exist. The second and third generation immigrants who identify more with their ancestral homeland than Sweden are already here. The criminal networks control territory and have arsenals. Social cohesion, once Sweden's greatest strength, is shattered. Trust, the invisible glue that held Swedish society together and made the welfare state possible, has evaporated. When you combine gang violence with the economic burden of low employment rates among immigrant populations, you see the full picture of how Sweden undermined itself. The country imported populations it could not integrate into a labor market that could not employ them, under a welfare system that could not afford them, creating parallel societies that reject Swedish values and in some cases wage literal war against Swedish society. And now, there is no clear path back. You cannot deport hundreds of thousands of people. You cannot reverse decades of failed integration. You cannot rebuild trust once it is destroyed. Sweden's attempt to be the world's humanitarian superpower has turned parts of the country into conflict zones. The peace that defined Swedish life for 2 centuries is gone, and it is not coming back. Can Sweden reverse this decline? Can it rebuild the industrial base, fix the welfare state, and restore social cohesion? The honest answer is that the Sweden of the 1980s is gone forever. The conditions that made that society possible, a homogeneous population, world-leading industries, high social trust, demographic balance, and geographic protection from global instability, no longer exist, and they cannot be recreated. The industrial champions are sold or gone. You cannot will a new Volvo or Ericsson into existence. Building world-class companies takes decades of accumulated expertise, capital, culture, and luck. Sweden no longer has the first 3 and cannot control the 4th. The welfare state's math does not work with current demographics and employment rates. Every projection shows spending exceeding revenue by growing margins. Without massive benefit cuts or tax increases that would trigger further exodus, the system will consume itself. And social cohesion, once shattered, takes generations to rebuild if it can be rebuilt at all. Some Swedes are adapting by leaving. Over 50,000 Swedish citizens emigrate permanently every year, many to Norway, Denmark, UK, or US. They are voting with their feet, concluding that the Sweden they knew is finished. Emigrate. Others are retreating into gated communities, private schools, and parallel infrastructure, essentially abandoning the universal systems that once defined Swedish identity. The wealthy are finding ways to protect themselves, but the middle class has nowhere to hide. Abandoning. Yet there is something dignified about how many Swedes face this reality. They are not rioting or demanding radical change. They are quietly adapting, holding onto the civility and orderliness that once defined their country even as the foundations crumble. Community groups still meet, volunteers still work, teachers still try to reach every student. There is a resilience in simply maintaining standards and values even when the system fails to support them. Perhaps Sweden is teaching the world an uncomfortable lesson, that good intentions are not enough, that generosity without limits becomes self-destruction, that tolerance extended to those who reject your values becomes submission, that social trust, once lost, cannot simply be legislated back into existence. Every wealthy nation looks at Sweden's attempt to combine open borders with a generous welfare state and sees the result. The math does not work. The cultures do not integrate. The system collapses. What comes next for Sweden? Most likely, a long, slow decline into being a middling European nation, still wealthy by global standards but no longer exceptional, still functioning but no longer efficient, still peaceful in most areas but with permanent zones of instability. The reinvention that could save the country, including massive tax reform, welfare restructuring, strict immigration controls, and serious integration requirements, faces political impossibility. Every interest group protects its piece of the old system even as the system dies. So Sweden will continue managing decline rather than courting revival. The country that once showed the world how to build a perfect society now demonstrates how even the best intentions can lead to ruin. Because prosperity is not just about having good values, it is about making hard choices, maintaining standards, and acknowledging reality even when reality is uncomfortable. Sweden chose kindness over sustainability, inclusion over cohesion, and ideology over arithmetic. The bill has come due, and the wealth that paid for Swedish exceptionalism is gone forever. Perhaps that is the most Swedish tragedy of all, being too polite to save yourself.